Let's get peppy. This is Pep with Chaz and special guest podcaster Bill Wyman. Welcome, Bill.
How are you, Chaz? Are you feeling better?
I'm feeling a little bit better.
I'm so glad.
Thank you very much. You had the same thing I had, which was
I sure did.
vaccinitis.
Yeah, the post-vaccine letdown. And boy, it hits hard, but then you bounce back and you feel good.
So far, so good. Unfortunately, Dr. Dave is not quite so lucky. I'll let him talk about his own diagnosis if he wants to when he comes back. I should say that this is not an illness thing, but John Barron is away from our TV show, Planet America, this Friday, which means I'm going to be carrying that pretty hard by myself. We might have a few special guests popping in now and then, but it means I'm probably unlikely to be able to record a podcast on Friday afternoon, but I'm going to try and do one early next week as well to catch up. And by then, Dr. Dave should be back for the week after. But anyway, thank you very much for popping in. It was only like 3 weeks ago you were last here, so thank you very much for that.
It might have been, yeah. It's always fun for me to get out of the house and talk a little. So
excellent. Well, let's get right into it. Let's start with, let's pretend this was last Friday when this podcast was meant to be. And the major story of the day was that there was a mooted agreement amongst 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans in the Senate for a bipartisan infrastructure plan. And this was not spearheaded by Biden at all. This was them just getting amongst themselves. The Republicans were Portman, Bill Cassidy, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Mitt Romney. Not a huge surprise there. And we didn't have a lot of details. We still don't have a lot of details. But we knew it was $974 billion across 5 years and $1.2 trillion across 8 years. And it was including $579 billion in new spending, which is about twice the amount of new spending that the previous mooted Senate deal would have had from the Republicans. That's fine. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of moolah. That's a lot more than the $10 billion infrastructure bank that Obama couldn't get up in 2009. Mm-hmm. We've come a long way from there. The sticking points were, though, there were 2 big sticking points. First of all was, as the Republicans made extremely clear, there were not going to be any tax increases. 0 tax increases. And Biden had drawn a soft line in the sand. Yeah, he can rub over it if he wants, but it was a very soft line in the sand saying, I want to raise taxes, corporate taxes at least. And the other big sticking point was they appear to have thrown the environment overboard somewhat. Now, John Tester from Montana said that some people will be happy with the environmental quotient out of this bill, but remember, a lot of what Biden was trying to do with his environmental plans was to sneak it in through the infrastructure bill, and presumably a lot of that has gone. At least it seems that way. Although we won't know for a little while yet. One thing we do know is that one way Susan Collins wants to pay for it is with taxes on not hybrid cars, electric cars, which is not very green.
It's such a Republican idea.
Yeah, let's take away all the environmental, there's a lot of the environmental funding and replace it with taxes on
to inhibit the thing that will reduce our dependence on foreign oil.
Exactly. I mean, look, the logic is reasonable, which is at the moment, in terms of user pays, there's a gas tax to pay for roads and highways and bridges, but people in electric cars pay nothing. That's what she was saying. And that logic is sound, but that logic is not very sound as far as saving the world goes.
Right, but also the logic isn't very sound when it comes to gas tax anyway, because the money that comes out of the gas tax, first of all, that's like a third rail in American politics. You can't raise the gas tax even though they should. It doesn't come anywhere near to handling even the infrastructure, much less the health and related costs, not to mention the, as they say, blood and treasure that has gone into America in fighting foreign wars over the whole oil thing. So it hasn't come anything near to that. So it's especially, but it's really it's actually a quite creative twist when it comes to Republican sort of talking points, because generally they're a lot cruder than that. You got to give her a little point or two for elegance, but it is incredibly specious and sophistic, I think.
So what do you think about this potential? I mean, you assume that if they've gotten to this point and Biden wants a deal bad enough and Manchin won't let him get away without a deal, then I mean, mind you, that's only 5 Republicans, not 10 Republicans, which you need to get past the filibuster.
Well, there's one line of thought, because D.C. is a very, very complicated thing. They have to get the votes. It's very complicated. And I'm so mistrustful of a lot of the coverage you get, because things are happening behind the scenes that we're not going to know about for 4 years probably, until the books are all written about this. But there is one...
Be a page turn of that book.
Well, no. I mean, it will be interesting about what he had to deal with, because, and you have to remember that Biden is a creature of the Senate, so he understands how these things work a lot better than a lot of people would.
He does.
But I think there's a really good argument to be made, and again, based on the superficiality of the reporting that we've seen, that it might be really good for Biden just to say he's got $1 trillion thing passed. You know, he can just wander around for the next 4 years saying, we passed $1 trillion in infrastructure. Anything that happens, he can just keep repeating that over and over, which is one of the reasons I think the Republicans really don't want this to happen. And so I think that now we're getting to the point, like, there's going to be a lot of people say, look, we can't even give him this win, because for the next 18 months, that's what he's going to be talking about leading up to the midterms. What
might be an interesting thing is, like I said, there's only 5 Republicans as part of this deal so far. What happens if they strike a deal, but there aren't 10 Republicans? And then the Democrats say, well, okay, no deal, let's go back to reconciliation. And then Manchin and Sinema say, no, this needs to be a bipartisan bill, even with reconciliation. Let's take some of these Republicans with us. Let's keep the deal we've got. I wonder what will happen then.
Yeah. They've really got themselves into a big mess with Manchin and Sinema. And who knew that Sinema was going to be quite that much of a menace? And seemingly, I don't quite understand, because I don't think her seat in Arizona is that unsafe.
No.
I think in the midst of the crisis that's happening, she could take all the votes she wants and have some cover moving forward, particularly as the state changes. And so there's a certain perniciousness in her behavior recently that has caught a lot of people by surprise.
Ironically, she may be making it less safe, because maybe the biggest threat to her is being primaried.
Yeah, it's possible.
Like come 4 years' time, which is when she's up.
I'm not sure who would do it, though. The Gallego is a kind of smart guy. I don't know how close they are, and so maybe something like that could happen. You're right. I mean, it's kind of hard to think of someone. She's a very unusual person, and you have to remember, too, that she got in by a whisker of a whisker of a whisker. I mean, she came in a very, very, very close race, and she's been kind of lucky. I don't know if we talked about this before, but when she first got into office as a senator, the Washington Post did a pretty scathing story about her that really could have cemented an image of her as being a little flighty, a little dishonest, a little unclear about her past, the tendency to exaggerate. And she kind of got through that, which was really good. And then, of course, she I don't want to say she lucked into the Senate seat, but she was running against Martha McSally, who was a uniquely bad and kind of
incompetent,
dumb person.
Yeah.
And even then, let's remember, I forget what the exact margin was, but it was minuscule.
It wasn't much.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't much.
And so it's really unclear, and I haven't read a lot about what's really going on inside her camp.
By the way, the answer to your question, who would have thought? The answer is me, because on this podcast, people who've listened to it for a long time will be able to tell you that my theory for a while has been that, and I continue to have this theory, that Manchin is not the sticking point, that Sinema is the sticking point. Like at the moment, we're all talking about Manchin, but Manchin, more often than not, he comes around at the end when it really, really counts. He comes around. He'll bellyache and he'll whine. He'll negotiate as hard as he possibly can, which is a sensible thing to do if you're a senator. You know, play your hand that you're dealt. But I don't remember a time when they needed his vote and he didn't deliver it. Yeah. Whereas Sinema, I'm not so sure about that. She seems to be very enigmatic and very weird, and she doesn't seem to talk much. She doesn't say what she wants. She just talks in motherhood statements, and she's so obtuse at times with her arguments. They don't seem to interact with reality at all. I think she's playing some kind of game, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. And I remember people in Arizona saying, oh, she's the smartest politician in the state. And when she got elected, you had to kind of give her credit. But I don't know if you remember, but I did a story on her race with Mark Sally at the time. So I got to talk to both of them at the time. And it's one of those modern races where they don't. Not only do they not talk to the press, they really don't care. So
sure.
I mean, I can say, I got to interview Kristen Sinema for a Senate race and Martha McSally, but I think I got a total of 22 minutes total with both of them. And with Martha McSally, it was almost entirely yelling at each other, and with her, it was just her kind of just staring at me and almost literally looking at her watch every 90 seconds. Sure. And this was for Phoenix Magazine, which is a big publication in Arizona. It wasn't like it was an insignificant thing. So they're operating in this world that you have to admit someone like her might be seeing something that we don't see, or she has always been a little bit mercurial and weird, and her political views have swayed greatly over the years, which is another thing to remember.
Yeah, she started off like a green.
But the other thing is that I don't think, just someone who lived in Arizona for a few years before I moved here, that she's an Arizona type person. Like, I don't think she's ever going to be taken to the bosom of the state. You know what I mean? That particularly being so weird and persnickety, and she will not be. No one on the right is going to say, "Oh my God, Kristen Sinema, she came through for us." No one's going to say that. They're all going to go for any right-wing person that runs against her. So I don't see her really husbanding her support in that way. So I don't quite understand it.
I should say something about infrastructure bills, by the way, because there's a lot of people looking at those dollar figures and trying to work out what this means for the Democrats or Republicans, depending on what happens, as far as the midterms go. And that is, I think infrastructure bills are way oversold in terms of being job creators. Like, people see $1 trillion and they go, whoa, that's a lot of money. But first of all, they ignore the fact it's over 8 years. And it's usually a tail end kind of bill, because there are very few projects that just lying around waiting to start, bang, in 6 months' time when you got the money. It usually takes years and years of environmental applications and applications to council or whatever, or all kinds of building regulations and so forth you got to follow through on, and development issues. And so that's the first thing. It usually takes years and years for it to even start, the funding to actually come through. Secondly, infrastructure is not labour intensive. It involves machines, lots and lots of machines. And a great stat here, according to the Bureau of Labour Statistics, in March 2021, the percentage of total non-farm payroll employees involved in all forms of infrastructure construction, 0.24% of employment.
Oh, that's pretty funny. Yeah. On the other hand, there's very little. I mean, that is, even if there were 10 times as much, that's not that much, right? But one of the things, one of the stories I've kind of been working on for the last 6 months or a year is I'm trying to figure out all the infrastructure projects going on in Sydney, just the Sydney area.
Oh, man, you should go to Melbourne.
Well, no, in Melbourne, leaving Melbourne aside, too.
Okay.
And then I was trying to total them all in the entire western United States. And I think there's more infrastructure being built or just recently opened in Sydney than in the entire western United States.
Because we always think of ourselves as pathetic with this kind of stuff.
It's extraordinary. No, there's light rail, and there's metros, and there's new underground tunnels, and there's the West Connects, and there's the Northern Beaches Tunnel, and there's the North Connect Tunnel, and then you guys are rebuilding Circular Quay, you're rebuilding the Opera House.
My cousin renovated his house.
There you go.
Don't forget that.
And there's a whole bunch of things I'm forgetting. Okay, there's a lot of enormous amounts of infrastructure going on. Everything that's going on over by what is it, Balmain? What is the town there where they're building all the West Connect interchange, underground interchange? Is it Roselle?
I've got no idea.
Yeah, the entire suburb is going to be undergirded with tunnels. It's extraordinary. And with the exception of Seattle, which is kind of an outlier, Los Angeles built one subway line, and now they're building another. San Francisco had to build a bridge after the Bay Bridge nearly collapsed during that one earthquake, so they did that. BART hasn't been expanded, which is the subway system in San Francisco. Phoenix built like 15 miles of light rail.
Well, that's really
Denver,
sad.
Like these things don't exist, and again, I think that the amount of building going on in Sydney right now is more than in the entire Western United States.
Well, like I said, Melbourne's got more, and then you should walk around Southeast Queensland. You need a construction hat just to walk around the street.
Oh no, and Melbourne, no, that's the thing though. That's the other thing. Everywhere you go, Wollongong, they have tons of stuff too. And the other interesting point is, I lost my train of thought, but it's so expensive to build in America too. That's the other thing, that it's going to be that I remember at some point 30, 40 years ago, I remember Dad saying it costs $1 million a mile to build a freeway. Can you believe that? And wow, probably costs $100 million a mile now these days. So
there's the classic example. I don't have the numbers on me because I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but the classic example was the California high-speed rail, which was supposed to be, what was it, LA to
San Francisco or Sacramento.
To San Francisco, yeah. So, okay. Yeah, and that's a fair journey. That's reasonable. And it was supposed to be what I think it was off the top of my head now. It was.
How many billions? Or
how many billions?
Yeah,
how many billions?
Yeah.
I think it was originally budgeted for like 20 billion or something like that. Something like that. And currently, it's now budgeted for well over $100 billion. It's going years over time, and it's now not connecting to any of the major cities. It's between two pissy little towns which no one would want to travel to or from, and that's the only place the line is, because it's just blown out so incredibly in the course of a decade.
It's very difficult because it's really easy to do it from what they call the Grapevine, which is below Bakersfield, up to around the Bay Area. But once you try to get it from the interior of California into the actual Bay Area, you got to get to Oakland, and then you have the San Francisco Bay, and then you have San Francisco, and then of course down south you have to get through the Grapevine, which is those mountains right above Los Angeles, and then once you're going to need some sort of very sophisticated tunneling system that I don't think California has the emotional will to do. And the other thing is that whole NIMBY thing, particularly in California, is very difficult to get anything done these days. And the only thing that does get done, it's kind of funny, are the ones that happen almost under the radar, because the San Francisco Bay Bridge, after the 1989 earthquake, it just seemed like there was no debate about it. There wasn't years of environmental. Someone just said, okay, we got to rebuild this bridge, and they did it. And there's also a bridge between Phoenix and Las Vegas over the Hoover Dam. And after 9/11, I think Hoover Dam was considered one of the most vulnerable places in the United States, because Hoover Dam had a 2-lane highway going over it. Okay. And I think they realized that just about anyone could knock that thing out with a camper truck, right? And so somewhere in the post 9/11 budgeting, they said, hey, here's $5 billion or $8 billion to build this extraordinary bridge. And Hoover Dam is when it was built, was one of the largest dams in the world, and it's over an extraordinary canyon. And there's a magnificent bridge now up above this canyon that was done with practically no public input at all. So once in a while that does happen in America.
By the way, the numbers I just looked up, I wasn't too far off. It started off at $33 billion back in 2008, and it's now over $100 billion. And so that's the California Hospital. The other stats I had here, which I did prepare, was about the delay. I mentioned the delay with infrastructure bills. A 2020 Congressional Research Service report found that the employment increase from the stimulus in 2009, was not sustained until 2015. It took that long.
Oh, for the money to get out there. That's such a good point.
Yeah. And the other point as well with infrastructure is that when the federal government is splurging $1 trillion, guess what the state and local governments will do? They'll do nothing. They normally pay for infrastructure. They'll just stop paying for infrastructure because all this stuff's happening around them. So there is going to be a diminution in the levels from the state and local governments to match. No, it won't match $1 trillion, but it's $1 trillion not as high as it seems when you take away the state and local infrastructure spending. Anyway, let's go on to a bit more Manchin filibuster type stuff with HR1, which is where we're at the moment, really. Now, this started with Joe Manchin's op-ed, which said, first of all, he wouldn't vote for HR1, which is the voting rights bill the Democrats are pushing. But more importantly than that, he said, quote, I will not vote to weaken or eliminate the filibuster. Full stop. Now, that's a bit more definitive than he's been until now, because he's speculated about maybe a talking filibuster or 55 votes instead of 60 votes and so on. But now he said no. And the Democrats kind of went nuts. There was Mondaire Jones, who tweeted, Manchin's op-ed might as well be titled, Why I'll Vote to Preserve Jim Crow. Jamal Bowman, these are his colleagues, by the way. Joe Manchin has become the new Mitch McConnell. Joe Manchin is doing everything in his power to stop democracy. And that's nothing compared to DNC chair Jamie Harrison, who this is what he said.
We're not asking for any partisan thing. This is not, people say, well, the both sides. This is not a both sides thing. Either you are for all Americans voting or you're against it. Either you're for securing democracy or you're against it. People need to make a decision on where they are on this issue, because it's not a both sides. It's either you're for America or you're against it.
So now Joe Manchin's against America. And that's a little counterproductive, because not only, we know that Manchin isn't the only one who's thinking this stuff. Like, he's the one who's talking, but we know at least Angus King has said he doesn't support HR1. And on top of that, it's a very open secret that, like, every reporter is talking off the record, is referring to off the record conversations, saying there are 7 or 8 Democrats who agree with Joe Manchin, who are letting him take the heat. We spoke to Heidi Heitkamp on our show on Friday and asked her, how many Democrats do you think actually secretly support Joe Manchin? And she said, well, I know of 7. Wow. So he's representing other people. So if you're saying he's anti-American, that's not necessarily going to help you in the long run with the negotiations, But anyway.
Well, so can I ask you a question about this?
Sure.
Again, one of the things you have to remember is that Biden was in the Senate, right? So he knows all these people. They go back decades and decades, and then there's these short-term and long-term strategies of the Biden administration, and basically, notwithstanding the West Wing and every other thing we've seen, people tend to know what's going to happen and when, okay? And they either know they're putting this out and they know they're going to lose that because then they'll get this other thing, or there's all sorts of various reasons. So you don't quite, particularly this early in an administration, when you have someone who is that much of a institutional person, not kind of an interloper like Obama in a way, who hadn't been a senator very long, or say a governor, who's not a creature of Washington. What we've kind of been expecting is for the Biden people, we'll talk about this later too, who is a very good chief of staff and runs a very, very good tight ship, that they know what's going to be happening and they basically have a plan. So we hope that's what's going on. Okay?
Yes.
But it might not be. That's the really, really, really big question. And I think it's a tiny bit worrisome when you see things like this. All I was going to say is that it's a portentous moment if that actually represents the kind of split that it does represent. And then later on we'll talk about Kamala Harris, because she's going to be heading up the voting rights thing as well.
We will get to her. It's funny you mention that, because once again, when we talked to Heidi Heitkamp, the thing that came through loud and clear with her is that she knows Joe Manchin pretty well. They were real close buddies in the Senate. And she seemed to be very much of the opinion that Joe Manchin knows what he's doing. He knows exactly when he's going to fold, and he will fold. She didn't put it that way, but it was pretty clear that's what she was saying. Like, she was saying he wants to do a deal. He wants to try and be as bipartisan he possibly can be. But if he can't get it, he's not going to sink the administration over it.
Yeah, that's the point I was getting at. You hope that there is that this is I don't want to say it's a gavotte, but it's people understand what's going on.
But the thing is, in the meantime, how much damage are you doing? If this extends for 6 months and people are saying things they can't take back, because they might all be in on the same game, possibly, but their supporters aren't.
Yeah.
The primary voters aren't. The people who gives the small donors who support the party aren't. And if they do it, and the people who turn up to vote aren't, and if they become discouraged because they think the whole government is turned to shit, and they're doing nothing, and they're playing pat a cake and playing political games instead of doing things, then you might not get them back. And especially if Joe Biden's approval rating starts to drop while this is happening, then all of a sudden these people who have a certain plan might change their plan if Joe Biden's approval rating is suddenly 47%.
Yeah, that's really, really true. And I totally understand that. But one thing I always think about when it comes to all these debates and voting rights itself is that it's the parties' job to get their people out, whatever the rules are. And so the availability of voting has greatly expanded over the past 10 or 20 years. Okay, and Democrats were electing people. Okay, and so they're not actually stopping people from voting, and a lot of times they're just closing down the early voting times, stuff like this. But generally, there is still early voting, et cetera, et cetera. And the only time it gets to be really scary is when they stop the early voting and then limit the number of polling places and physically make it, and that could be a problem. But I don't want to say 99% of the time, but a huge percentage of this can be overcome by the parties doing their frickin' jobs. And the Democrats have not been doing their job in the past however long. And so that, to me, is the much bigger worry. And I wish people were talking about that. I wish people were talking about why did we almost lose this last election as opposed to, basically whining and complaining when it was their job to not lose all these state legislatures and let them restrict the voting even more.
I think that's a great point. And actually, I'm going to come very soon to something which they're not doing now, which I think they should be, which is not covered by HR 1. Because in my view, actually, I don't like HR 1. I mean, there's some things I like about it. Some things are great about it. For instance, getting rid of gerrymandering is wonderful. And there's a few things that are really important. But for instance, banning voter ID nationally is stupid. That's not going to happen. Voter ID is incredibly popular around America. Like the idea that you are going to successfully ban all voter ID, not only is it a political no contest, like it's just not going to happen, but on top of that, why would you even want to do that? Like to say, like, I understand the problems with voter ID, like when you got these restrictions on the kinds of voter ID that are available, but the idea of having no ID whatsoever to vote, that doesn't make sense.
Well, I will say, though, that my entire life, I don't ever remember showing ID at a voting thing. You sign, you go in and you sign a little thing, and that's how you vote. You vote with your signature, really. And so I take your point, but traditionally in America, you haven't had any sort of vote.
Look, in Australia, we often don't have voter ID as well. But the difference in Australia is compulsory. So there are only some people who are going to vote, right? Yeah. Whereas in America, let's put it this way. Like, to me, if I was a Democrat and I was trying to make it easy for people to vote, I would just be making anything voter ID. I would be saying, okay, water bills. And,
that's a good point.
Electricity bills. Like things like it's not about trying to come up with this perfect fingerprint kind of system. It's just a case of just making it easy enough for the real person to be able to do it. Give them a good kinds of options. But it's not just that. On top of that, I don't want to go into HR 1. I've talked about it a few times. But public funding is another example of something where you just go, why are you fighting out public funding in here? We've got bigger problems right now than public funding. For instance, I mean, in HR 1, they've got a situation where for every small donor, the public pays 6 times as much to the candidate, right? In New York, they have the same system, except for it's 8 times as much in the mayoral contest at the moment, right? Okay. All the major candidates have super PACs. Why? They've got public funding. This is what HR 1 is supposed to cure. The New York mayoral contest is even better because it's 8-1 and there's no Republicans involved. But they all have super PACs. A third of the money raised there is from super PACs. So you go, okay, well, that just proves that it's not going to work, does it? So why are we fighting about that? That's
a good point.
Rather than things like gerrymandering, which is just such a travesty. But
gerrymandering is difficult.
But the thing that I was going to say that I was saying there's things that they're not doing that they should do. Okay, because to me there are 3 issues they're electoral issues that people are saying need to be solved. Okay. One is the stuff that you just talked about, the little stuff, the little access stuff, like early hours and all that kind of stuff, where it's on the margins, about trying to improve access as much as possible. Obviously, I support, well, not obviously, but I do support giving people as much access to the vote as possible. Republicans are fighting some of that. HR 1 gives as much access as possible. Now, personally, I think that's a very marginal issue because I think there's already plenty of access. Like you just said, if they do their jobs, they'll get their voters out, right? But HR 1 deals with that very well. The next thing is stuff like system issues like gerrymandering and stuff like that, which to me is a very important stuff. HR 1 deals with gerrymandering of congressional seats, federal congressional seats, and that's it. Doesn't deal with, and it's not their fault because a lot of it's state issues. State gerrymandering is so much worse than federal gerrymandering. It doesn't touch that at all, right? And we don't even need to get me started on the Senate. Like it's not gerrymandered, but just it's obviously a very biased institution that just the way the population is distributed in America, right? HR1 only deals with a little bit of that. But the big one, the one which is actually the problem, everyone acknowledges that this is the problem, is that the Republicans right now are going around firing people who were responsible in 2020 and replacing them with hacks in 2024. And these are the people who will make a decision about whether the election was legitimate in 2024. That's the biggest problem. The Republicans who stood between Donald Trump and his bullshit lie about winning the election, they're gone. They're all gone. The people who are replacing them are the people who are hacks, who will let anything happen. And there's a real concern that if we have exactly the same situation in 2024 that we had in 2020, the result might not be the same, because the people in charge may well they may well not be responsible, and they may well allow the election to be stolen. Then you've got a real problem.
I really agree. And the other interesting thing is that America is in certain ways a racist country and has lingering kind of things. And I can say that just living there, that you can see these undercurrent things. In this year, you actually had a distinguished older gentleman, white guy, running against Trump, right? Yeah. But imagine if it was Kamala Harris.
Yeah, that's right.
In a lot of these states, there's really going to be people, like you could even see in Arizona, they did kind of fiddle with it, but I'm not really sure we needed that Kamala Harris in there. You can kind of see that some of this, I think, if in Georgia and Arizona particularly, if this had been a Barack Obama kind of thing, you didn't have the 2008 economic downturn and stuff like this, I bet it could have been just a tiny bit different. Yeah. Not necessarily in the vote, but the populace reaction to the closeness of the wins.
I understand. Well, by the way, what I just said and what you're talking about there, HR1 doesn't deal with any of that. And once again, it's not their fault, because they wrote HR1 before these kinds of stuff was really in full effect. There is a way to deal with it, which the Democrats are not doing at the moment, which is to amend the Electoral Count Act. I'm not going to go into details now because it's going to take me a while, and I don't want to waste all your time. I'll do this next podcast. But there is a bill that can be amended that can deal with the shit that's happening right now, and no one is amending it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And if I was a Democrat, I would make that the hill to die on with Joe Manchin and just go, you know what? Republicans, number one, you might even get 10 Republicans to go with it, because it is just explicitly about, we're not going to let that bullshit vote that happened on January 6th happen again. Yeah. And if it does, they're not going to win it because of the changes we make to the Electoral Count Act. But if they don't get 10 Republicans, and the cynic in me says they won't get 10 Republicans, then that is the thing to break the filibuster with. To say, Joe Manchin, here is the situation. This is the bill that will stop an election being stolen. Yeah. Are you up for it or not? And I reckon he'd be up for it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But anyway, I want to read a quote as well on this kind of topic, which was from a Ron Brownstein article, which I thought was pretty good. So I'll just read the quote. And, Manchin's acting like Republicans and Democrats are working together on this stuff, and Republicans in Arizona have completely shut the Democrats out of the legislative process. Katie Hobbs, the Democratic Secretary of State there, told me in an interview. Similar, Jennifer Konst, the Democrat whip in the Iowa House of Representatives, said, "It's unfathomable to me that we would look at this issue and say we have to bring Republicans along in this political climate in order to make true change. I don't see anywhere where Republicans are inviting Democrats along, or inviting Democrats to the table. Why are some Democrats saying I won't do this unless it's bipartisan?" And leaving aside the fact, the partisan nature of this, I think it is true that on the state level, there is no attempt at bipartisanship whatsoever.
Oh, yeah.
But on the federal level, people say, we've got to be bipartisan. And I always feel like Joe Manchin and his friends are playing a game that no one else is playing. And I certainly didn't see anyone playing that game when Merrick Garland was nominated in 2016, I should say, as well, even at the federal level.
Well, and it goes back
to your thoughts?
It goes back to this other thing that I think that that so much of the discussion that goes on about politics in America is just about politics. It is, they don't talk about the issues. All these multiple hours in CNN, they just have all these idiots jabbering at each other and do even worse than us. Because
wow, I don't believe that.
Because they're at least we have opinions and we're defending them, and so many of the people just have these talking points, and there isn't a back and forth. So, but when it does come down to the raw politics, it does come down to this thing I said before, that it's the Democrats' job to win these issues. And one thing I think they've really fallen down on is all these protests, all the racial stuff, all the critical race theory, and maybe which we'll talk about some later. Yep. But I don't, again, during the campaign, Joe Biden literally did say this once. He literally once said, look, we support the police. Police need to be trained better. Nobody thinks that unarmed black people should be killed. We're all on the same side of this. We need to stop the protests and reform the police. Okay, he actually said that in one of the debates. Now, the problem was that Donald Trump was yelling at him during the whole thing. Okay,
I remember that.
And I remember this really well. And that I don't see. I've said this, and I actually wrote a column, I think, for the City Morning Herald about this. But I think it got caught in some things that didn't get printed. But I actually really early on wrote something out that that Biden might have lost the election because of this issue, because it's not that hard. Everyone agrees on that. Everyone supports the police. Nobody hates the police. Nobody doesn't think that they're young, vulnerable people who, and obviously there's some bad police, yes, but of course in any profession there's some bad apples and things like this, and that they need to be trained better and there needs to be reform. And particularly my little pet thing that we'll get to later on, the issue of crime in America. Crime in America has been going down for 20 years. You don't need this heavily militarized police, these sorts of police forces. And nobody thinks that people should be running around breaking windows and protest. Everyone thinks you should protest. Nobody thinks you should be going around breaking windows and burning down stores and stuff like that, the kind of stuff we've seen. And why the Democrats have not been able to articulate that simple, virtually universally held position is mystifying to me. And I think that if he and Kamala Harris had just said that from the start, that we support Black Lives Matter, we support the protests, we don't support violence, period. We support the police, we don't support extrajudicial shootings of unarmed people, and we want the police to be trained better so this doesn't victimize either side. And they don't say that. And again, I think that what it comes down to is why is the country still so divided given all the chaos of the Trump years? And I think it's because they haven't been able to articulate these simple things, and the Republicans take enormous advantage of it. And so instead of having this clear majority in the Senate, they're caught in this position where they have to worry about what Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema thinks.
I think, yeah, that's fair enough. I was going to say, to answer your question, I feel like social media has encouraged an absolutism in people's arguments and a lack of nuance. And I think that's increasingly reflected in politics, where there should be nuance and there shouldn't be absolutism, and it's quite annoying. Yeah. and part of absolutism is to deny that. Like, I mean, I saw it on social media all the time that there was when the protests first started, the George Floyd protests first started, and there was some obvious rioting going on. Some obvious rioting. Now, sure, some of those rioters definitely were taking advantage of a protest to provide cover for them to just come and rob places. They weren't necessarily political rioters. Some of them were anarchists. Some of them had nothing to do with BLM at all. They were taking advantage of the situation. Some of them were right-wingers, like the Boogaloo Boys, who were also just trying to accentuate the differences and so forth. I'm not saying that they were all BLM people, but I'm saying there was no doubt that some of those protests were violent. Some of them had violence in them. And there was a complete denial of that on social media from the left. Yeah. They completely refused to accept that was the case. Now, in the end, the actual number, I think, from memory, once again, I don't have the number in front of me, I think it was 6% of the protests had violence in them. In the end, that was the final count for the whole sort of summer of protests. And people saying, see, 94%, that's overwhelmingly peaceful. Yes, but if you were part of the 6%, they weren't very peaceful. Yeah. You just need to acknowledge reality. That's not picking a side. That's not all of a sudden being racist or condemning Black Lives Matter. That's just saying acknowledging reality, that there was violence there. And I found it very frustrating how hard it was for people to acknowledge that.
And I think, and then to go back to it, it's also a failure of politics, because you'd think that these places would have a mechanism in place. That maybe it's because maybe it's because it was so long ago, but I spent a lot of time in Berkeley, in the Bay Area, covering protests, the Diablo Canyon nuclear protests, where they're incredibly well organized. It was all done by consensus, and it was easy to make fun of it and stuff like this. But they had these very strict nonviolent protocols and all these they thought everything out, and they all voted on it. It had to be done by consensus. And you'd think there'd be something that said, hey, the minute you see any violence, everyone should just stop and sit down. Or something like that. There's all these mechanisms you can do to dissociate yourself from it and have people who can communicate and not let that happen. But I think, it's decadent to be marching and seeing violence and not do anything about it. And I also think it's wrong to see that kind of thing and not condemn it universally, and just everyone say we don't support this, and we're gonna protest in a way, in a big open space where that won't happen or something. That's what I don't get.
I can understand why people weren't stopping it. Like, you'd be scared. Like, if there's people, looting places and stuff and setting places on fire, you don't want to be a hero. I can understand that.
Oh, no, I don't mean them tackling them. I mean just stopping. Saying, let's go home, or let's go to a place where...
Often those people had marched on somewhere else. Like New York was a classic example where the protests would go in one direction and the rioters would go in another direction.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah.
But
it's
anyway, hard.
But the whole thing is just... don't even get me started on the phrase defund the police. Like, I had so many arguments with Dave about this where I was going, we all know no one means actually don't fund the police. Yeah. Like, what people mean is maybe reduce funding slightly and use that funding to increase social services. That's what they mean. So why not say that? Because when you say defund the police, people think you mean $0 for the police. Right. And some idiots do think that, but not many. Anyway, let's move on. I'll save this for another time. There's a good thread. Actually, no, I'll just read this very quickly. This is just to wrap up the filibuster thing before we move on. There's a great thread from Adam Gentleson from a tactical point of view, which I'm gonna summarize here, but I'll put the full thread in the homework. If you look up in the homework in the blurb, you'll be able to see it there. Back in 2005, Republicans really, really wanted to go nuclear to confirm Bush's judges. Bush, Cheney, and Frist were all eager to go nuclear. In May, Republican Floor General Mitch McConnell announced the Senate is prepared to restore the Senate's traditions and precedents and go nuclear. At issue were the nominations of a bunch of hyper-conservative Bush judicial nominees, like William Pryor and Janice Rogers Brown. Dems were using the filibuster to block them. That's when the famed Gang of 14 struck a very stupid deal, whereby Dems retained their right to filibuster, but were only allowed to use it under extraordinary circumstances. Dems were very conscientious in how they applied this standard, and Republicans basically convinced them that no one actually met it. Most of the controversial Bush nominees at the heart of the controversy got confirmed, all with fewer than 60 votes. They all could have been filibustered. In other words, Bush got most of the judges that he threatened to go nuclear over without having to go nuclear. And then the Bush White House sought to put forward judicial nominees who would test the boundaries of the deal, forcing Democrats to filibuster and give Republicans an excuse to go nuclear like they'd wanted to do all along. One of those nominees the Bush White House put forward to test the Gang of 14 deal was Brett Kavanaugh. Deeming that Brett Kavanaugh didn't meet the extraordinary circumstances standard and boxed in by Republicans' nuclear threat, Dems did not filibuster Kavanaugh and let him be confirmed to the DC Circuit with fewer than 60 votes, thereby laundering most of his record. So, what did Democrats get out of this Gang of 14 deal? Jack shit. What did Republicans get? Pretty much all the judicial nominees they wanted. But wait, Republicans also got to preserve the filibuster, which Dems had fallen over themselves to enshrine. When Obama won, did the remaining Republican members of the Gang of 14 apply the extraordinary circumstances standard as conscientiously as the Dems had under Bush and help confirm key Obama nominees? Of course not. Instead of being able to confirm whoever he wanted on a majority vote because ours had gone nuclear under Bush, Obama had to slog for 5 years to get his nominees confirmed. If Dems had just let Republicans go nuclear, Republicans would have gotten the same crop of judicial confirmations, and Obama could have nominated whoever he wanted to be confirmed with just a majority in a Senate where he had 60-ish Democrats. This would have been a very different dynamic. So, in the end, they went nuclear in 20... So that's his threat. And so his message is They went nuclear in 2013, except for on the Supreme Court, which Mitch McConnell then punished them for, again with Merrick Garland. So don't let history repeat itself. The end of the filibuster is inevitable. Go nuclear now instead of in 10 years' time after you've paid a price for your delay.
Right.
That's his message.
No, it's just totally true. The Democrats are such an incompetent political party, and they have so, just in capitalistic terms, they have so much ammunition to just destroy the Republican brand. And again, when you go back to 2020, I just haven't quite read anything yet that really explains the election, because America's hostility and distrust of Russia. How was Trump a credible candidate on that thing? Competency. How was he a credible thing? Racism. How? Like his association with just corruption and just general buffoonery and just being stupid. He has nothing against Melania, but he has this wife who can barely speak English, and even when she does speak, she can't say anything intelligent at all, and generally first ladies. Just every single superficial metric, and I'm not endorsing that view at all. I'm just saying these are all the superficial optimism. Yeah. American. Remember how Reagan? He was the optimism is always going. Every single one of those things, on their own, are things that have destroyed other presidential candidates. And the fact that he nearly won, is something I literally still don't understand, and B, I think can be somewhat explained by the fact that Democrats are just so incompetent just in terms of marketing. And I realize there's people in the Democratic Party, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm sure there's people who could sit down with them and say, listen, you guys don't even understand what goes on in terms of Facebook and Twitter and all these other things. The world is completely different. This is how they work, and it's much more difficult. I take that point. But just on the surface, I don't see this at all, how it happens.
I don't want to step on your incompetence point because I think it's right, but I think that the reason Trump won was because of the time that he was running. Like, I think that someone could equally say Joe Biden on the verge of senility, like a guy gaffing his way through an election campaign, hiding in his room, not campaigning for, only campaigning 3 hours a day, etc. Like in any other period, he would not have won the election. He would have got blown out of the water 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Yeah. I think we're going to see over and over again people winning elections where you go, how did that person win an election? Because when you've got massive partisanship, it doesn't matter. Yeah. It just matters whether you can turn out slightly more of your people than their people, and the candidate might be irrelevant to that. So,
but now again, I do see that too. Yeah. But on the other hand, Trump had alienated so much of his base. Yeah, that's the thing, I know. That you have, that these are those swing voters. So,
yeah. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. Just quickly.
Stats Nugget.
Very quick one. Some of you guys might have seen this because it's not a secret, this one, but I think it's worth commemorating to those who haven't. Gallup came out with a poll couple of days ago. 70% now support gay marriage. 70%. That's compared to, in 1996, 27%. 43% change in 25 years. 2% a year consistently for 25 years. 55% of Republicans support gay marriage now. A majority. 60% of 55 and overs support gay marriage now. And when you get into the kids, 18 to 34s, that's 84%. So that's an incredible change over 25 years. Yeah.
I know it is, and it's even more pernicious than that because I think there's a real strong argument that in 2000, if I have the election rate, and forgive me if I'm getting this wrong.
I think you think 2004, depending on what you're about to say.
When did Gavin Newsom start doing marriages in California? Was that I thought that was in 2000.
2004 was the one where George Bush ran hard against gay marriage.
Yeah, maybe that was it. And that there was, whichever one it was, I remember thinking at the time that they should have gone to him and say, what are you doing? This isn't anything we want to fight about in Ohio right now. And so there's an argument that says that was a key thing, part of all the other craziness in the 2004-2000 election. So it used to be a very thing. And here's again, to go back to my other point, why are the Republicans why aren't they just completely in generations branded as the anti-gay party, the people who maim, castrate, throw out, scourge, shun this poor and hated part of society? Like, why aren't they permanently in 2 generations' mind now as the party that hates gay people? And it's just kind of like, oh, well, it's religious issues. And like, it just feels like they get a pass for some of this stuff.
Let's talk immigration, and we're going to go to Kamala Harris from that. So, first of all, I just want to give an update on the numbers. 180,000 crossed in May. That's an all-time record for May. Third consecutive month of more than 170,000 migrants crossing. That's the first time that's happened since 2000. The number of migrants illegally crossing the border this fiscal year, so far, in 8 months of this fiscal year, is the most since every complete year since 2006. There's 899,000 so far. 4 months left to go in the fiscal year. The record is 1.64 million in 2000. They're not going to get there. The 6th highest in history was 997 with 1.37 million. I reckon they're on target to get that. If they average 95,000 for the last 4 months, they'll pass that. That's my guess at this point anyway. But here are some important numbers. You hear those numbers a bit. These are the numbers you don't hear so much. Out of 180,000, I know I've talked about this before, but I'm going to keep on reinforcing it because no one else talks about this. Out of 180,000 that crossed the border, 112,000 were bounced immediately under Title 42. 62% of all border crossers were immediately bounced. They didn't even ask them their name. Just piss off straight away. If you are a single adult, you're gone. Straight away. For those who don't remember, Title 42 is their COVID protection title. So they're still under basically national quarantine as far as single adults go, where anyone who comes in illegally, they're gone. It doesn't matter if they have the best asylum case in the world. They don't ask them. They just go away. So when you hear about open borders, not for 62% of the border crossers. Immediately piss off. That's the first thing. And some of these guys, they just keep on trying because they try and get around them. So 38% of the encounters in May were people who had already been bounced. And that's compared to 15% average from 2014 to 2019. So this is what's happening. And more just trying to come back, which is part of the reason the numbers are high because they just keep trying over and over again. Those 180,000 aren't necessarily individuals. They might be maybe some people have come 3-4 times during that month. They get bounced, they come back, and so on. I should add, by the way, 2 things. First of all is that when they try and come back, they try and come back in more dangerous ways to try and get past. And usually they will pay the people smugglers a lot more money to try and get the deluxe treatment so they can get around them. And the deluxe treatment usually involves having a bunch of families and kids coming, which occupies the border police because those people get accepted. And while they're getting accepted by the border police, then the adults come past a couple of miles down the road where there's no border police. So that's the deluxe treatment, right? Anyway, the important point is 62% again bounced immediately. You do not hear that much from the press. That's the first thing. Next thing, families are down from 50,000 to 44,000. 1 out of 5 of the families are expelled under Title 42, the COVID one. Unaccompanied minors are also down. From 3 months ago, it was 19K. Then 2 months ago, it was 17K. This month, it's 14K. That's still too much. That's still, all 3 of them are records compared to the past. It was 11,000 was the previous record before this administration, as far as unaccompanied minors, but it's going down. One more thing that you don't hear much. Mexican children are not granted asylum. When you're hearing about children granted asylum and families, not Mexicans. The Central Americans are, Mexicans are not. Why? Because they've got this strange... in fact, sorry, I should just say that that 1 in 5 of all unaccompanied children are Mexican and 95% of them are sent back. The reason for that is because there's something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. Amnesty put out a report about it this week. It applies to Mexicans and Canadians, and it's basically been misused to return children who are suspected of being trafficked. And they just say any child basically who comes over is trying to send them back. Now, they're supposed to screen the children to confirm that they're not afraid to return to Mexico and they do not require protection and that they're returning voluntarily. A lot of times they don't screen. They don't actually screen them. They just send them back, and a lot of these kids are signing forms that they don't even know what they mean, and then they're on their way back. So that's what's going on there. Yeah. So, not open borders for Mexicans either. Yeah.
Well, it just brings me back to this recurring thing that I see in other parts of the world that those of us who of my generation, we assume, when it comes to NAFTA, when it comes to the PPP, all these world things and things like that, America doesn't do things. Trump has this thing, America's weak, America's being taken to the cleaners, America's doing all this stuff. There's all these immigrants coming in that are victimizing America. Well, that doesn't really happen. And under Obama, of course, he was the deporter in chief, right? He was incredibly strict on the border because, of course, Democrats have to be stronger on the border than because they get attacked. And of course, it doesn't matter anyway because that message isn't going to get through to Fox News people. And so you kind of wonder why they even do it. But so none of this really surprises me because this is the way, first of all, America is not set up to help. Despite what you hear from Trump and on people on the right, it is not set up to help these people really. There are some, which is great. And of course, America is laudable for it. We should do more because it helps make the country a better country. But and you wonder what the messaging is going to be. And we'll get into this as we talk to Kamala Harris, that they need to, again, it's this balanced thing where we are opening our hearts and doors open to victimized people around the world, but also they have to act tough at the same time. And it is a messaging challenge, unlike some of the other stuff we've talked about. Yeah,
it is. By the way, just to put in context about the Mexicans who just bounced as well. Well, not bounced, they're sent back almost immediately. Take a guess how many, just to give you an idea of the state of Mexico, take a guess how many Mexican politicians were killed during the last election campaign.
Oh my God, I don't even want to.
This is including local, okay? So this is not just national politicians. This is local politicians as well.
I don't know.
Just during the campaign, the answer is 97. Yeah. 97 politicians were killed and 935 were attacked during the last election campaign, according to security consultancy Intellect. So yeah, it's not a nice place there. Anyway, let's talk about Kamala Harris. We've set up the situation. She just went to Guatemala to fix everything. Tell us about the situation.
It's really interesting what's happening with her. So let's talk big picture political stuff first. Okay, she's a vice president. She has a unique position, right? She's the first woman vice president. She's the first person of color, et cetera, and she's living in this very weird, hostile world where Biden has this glow about him still, and of course on the right, she's someone, since she is a person of color, since she is a woman, they can use all those things about her, even though she's a fairly mainstream Democrat and actually has a fairly good record, or I shouldn't say good, but has a fairly moderate record, and sometimes even less than moderate record when it comes to certain cherished Democratic issues. So
she reminds me of Joe Biden. I was saying this during the election campaign. She reminds me so much of Joe Biden in that she's a classic weather-vane politician who will just say what she needs to say to win. She's not going to go for anything ideological. She'll just go where the party goes. Which is Joe Biden.
Well, and she's a classic person, but just coming up, she's almost like a Giuliani type figure, where you make your bones being a prosecutor and being the tough crusading person, of course. But of course, she has all these unique aspects.
Which of course Biden also did. He wasn't a prosecutor, but he was Mr. Law and Order for 20 years as well. Anyway, go on.
That's true. Yep. So and vice presidents are just such an odd group of people, right? I'm sure you know the John Nance Garner quote, the vice presidency isn't worth a bucket of warm spit, except he didn't say spit. And that's been something that's lingering, but of course in the 70s and 80s that really changed. Okay, it changed with Mondale and then changed with Gore, and now we have this idea of the partnership, which gets used in all sorts of different ways. On the Republican side, we've seen people like Sarah Palin, who's one of the most obviously unqualified people who've ever run for the presidency. And before her, we had Dan Quayle, right, who actually was vice president. Unbelievable, even though he was remarkably unqualified. And so the model is this partnership model, which is going to be the Al Gore, Walter Mondale, Joe Biden model, where you actually have a very, very substantive person. It's not clear yet whether she's going to be the well-known last voice in the room. Like that's something Biden always said when in relation to Obama, that he was the last person Obama talked to before he made the. Okay, which brings us to the next thing about vice president, which it's all an image. Like who knows whether Biden was really the last person in the room when Obama made these decisions, but it was decided in the Obama-Biden administration that would be the line about Biden. Okay, so all of these things that we read about her over the next 4 years, we have to kind of think about in the context of what is the image that this presidency wants to put out about her. Okay? And obviously, it's a little delicate because she is a woman. She is a person of color. He has to treat her with the utmost respect and, which he would do anyway, but that's something they have to really worry about. So the line we're getting now, which is in a flurry of, and the world has changed a lot, so these things don't matter the way they did, say, 10 or 20 years ago. But 10 or 20 years ago, if there were 2 or 3 stories in the New York Times, the Washington Post, all banging on the same thing about a certain political figure, you go, wow, that was an amazing bit of political muscle that was put to put this image out. So nowadays they don't have the same effect. But for the record, the New York Times and the Washington Post have been doing all these stories about her role in the administration, how she's going to be working with Joe Biden, and what her role is going to be going forward. And they haven't been entirely laudable or positive, but you can see the beginnings of this image making starting now.
Okay, so given that,
So, and what we've learned is that she's going to take on these 2 issues. One is immigration, but specifically, it's not clear exactly if it's immigration, but taking care of these certain Central American countries, where a lot of this is coming from, which are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Oh, by the way, just let me pick up there, because she gets verbal a lot about this. People saying, "Oh, why don't you go down the border? Why isn't she solving the border issues?" Let me quote Joe Biden. On the day that he appointed her, unofficially with his role, I've asked her, the VP, today to lead our efforts with Mexico and the Northern Triangle and the countries that are going to need help stemming the migration to our southern border. Now, there's a bit of stuttering in there I left out, but he was very clear about the fact that her job was to deal with Mexico and the Northern Triangle. It wasn't to deal with the border.
Right, and specifically, it's smart. It's saying, we all know the border is a problem. Let's go look at these countries where the people are coming from and see if we can change things. Yeah. And obviously, Mexico has incredible problems, but it's come a long way. With the help of things like NAFTA. And America has particularly responsibilities with these countries in the middle of Central America. They're kind of there between Mexico and Nicaragua. There's these 3 countries. America basically ran Honduras for 20 years. It was basically a Puerto Rico type thing, and there were American guys who were down there running it. These countries have suffered coups. El Salvador, of course, had a military junta for a long time. Guatemala suffered through a terrible genocide that that's the kind of thing that shakes up the psyche of a country and severely damages it. And it's kind of interesting the way the media works. But do you know what a Hurricane Mitch was?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah,
it's just that we hear Haiti got hit and Puerto Rico got hit and stuff like. Well, Honduras is a very large country, and Hurricane Mitch basically destroyed the entire country at a certain point. So after 20 or 30 years of being an American military depot for the Contra War against Nicaragua and all these kind of crazy damage, I was in Honduras when I was a kid. Basically, I worked in a refugee camp on the border with El Salvador, and when I was in San Pedro Sula, the National Assembly was taken hostage. And to this day, I remember the word rehenes because the word rehenes was in like 120-point type on the cover of the tabloid newspapers in San Pedro Sula, and rehenes means hostage. So these are things that people like me have a very long memory about, and we have a lot of responsibility for these countries.
Well, given that you've got personal experience in this part of the world, do you feel like, the knock on what Harris is doing here is saying, okay, you can try to do that. It's not really a knock on Harris, it's not her fault, but saying the Biden administration trying to stop asylum seekers by making these countries livable is an absurd thing to try to do in the short term. maybe in the long term, way past this presidency. But they say it's going to take a lot more than 4 or 8 years to fix up Central America.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you
but
agree with that?
Of course.
Yeah.
But it is calling attention to this problem, saying, oh, why all of a sudden are we hearing about these Guatemalans and these Salvadorans and Hondurans at the border? Well, it's because Guatemala has, still has this terrible corruption, and every country has its own kind of specific problem.
Got a good link about Guatemala corruption. I'll put in the homework if you have a look. It's about the last sort of 40 years of Guatemalan corruption and exactly why it's so hard to solve. And by the way, Guatemala was the country she visited. She didn't visit Honduras or El Salvador, so you can only imagine that they're worse off than Guatemala is.
They all have different, but also there's other damages there. If you go to Honduras, then people start writing about the United States' involvement, and you still have these large food companies that control things. But of course, you have these recurring coups and stuff like this. And then El Salvador, of course, we held up the Salvadoran military, which at the time was slaughtering religious people and stuff like this, not to mention kids. And so when I was in the refugee camp, it was a Salvadoran refugee camp over the border, the Honduran side of the border. And so America and the UN was basically housing these people in this mile square refugee camp because the Salvadoran military was driving its own people out of the country.
It's going to be an interesting place, El
terrible.
Salvador, in the next little while, because I'm not sure if you saw, but they've just made Bitcoin one of their official currencies. So I don't know where that's going. I think it's a bit of a gamble. Look, it might work out really well for them. I mean, they might get a lot of investment, but at the same time, it is the official currency of ransomware. So who knows where that ends up?
Maybe it'll be the Estonia of Central America.
Maybe. Anyway.
And again, let's not remember things like a friend of mine wrote a book on the Guatemalan genocide, which I read, and so that's another thing that we don't pay attention really. That we've heard about the genocide in Rwanda and in Armenia and in Serbia and things like this, but we kind of forget that when that happens, terrible, terrible things happen in a country. And so it's really good that they're doing that. But I totally agree with you that she is getting caught up in that. Why aren't you going to the border? I don't know if you saw that Lester Holt thing.
I'll play it. Here we are, just for the three
and just to
people.
set it up, that what happens in America sometimes is you have these quote unquote, from the so-called liberal media, and they get sort of browbeaten into asking these quote unquote tough questions, right? So the one I always bring up is in one of the debates, George Stephanopoulos asked Barack Obama that pressing question, why don't you wear an American flag pin? Okay, so this is the context of that Lester Holt, who's a smart guy, he's on NBC, feels that he has to keep pressing her on this completely insipid talking point of the right.
And this is the result.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
I'm here in Guatemala today. At some point, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I don't understand the point that you're making. I'm not discounting the importance of the border.
Well, I mentioned it because I know Republicans have certainly come at you on this, but Democratic Congressman Cuellar has a border district, has said to you and the president, come. You need to see this.
Listen, I care about what's happening at the border. I'm in Guatemala because my focus is dealing with the root causes of migration.
Okay, so that's a classic example. I agree with you. It's an asinine angle, but it's a classic example where you go, okay, the angle is lame, but she obviously should have been prepared for it because it's all right-wingers have talked about for the last 3 months, and she did not deal with that well.
Exactly.
But she should have had a prepared answer going into that interview. But yeah, whatever. We've talked about this on the show endlessly. Do you have anything to say about that?
Just that it is this. It's unfortunate because it's a specific issue that could be brought up or not brought up, but because it's been so magnified on the right, the so-called liberal media, even though it isn't, it's just the mainstream media feels like it needs to bring it up. And then, and occasionally you get your little finger caught in the machinery, which is what happened to her right there. I don't think it's a big deal, and we have to remember that vice presidents really don't matter, and this will be forgotten.
Of course, yeah.
And so, but the one other thing we should say about Kamala Harris is that according to all these stories, she's been giving these two charters, right? One is to deal with not necessarily immigration, but working on some of the economic issues in Central America that cause all this immigration, and particularly the political refugees, which is incredibly unfortunate, but also the voting rights thing, and that she's going to be heading up the administration efforts in that area, which again is another kind of odd thing. And some people are saying she's kind of getting, she's kind of drawing some poor hands because these are both thankless sort of issues, and particularly if they can't get H.R. 1 passed. On the other hand, for the voting rights, she is a really great advocate to go around to all these states and call attention to the problem. So I don't think that is a bad thing for her. The one other thing that I think people should take away from those stories that I thought was really interesting is that it said that she was having lunch once a week with Ron Klain, okay? And Ron Klain is, Biden's chief of staff. He's a very, very, very competent person. You don't hear much about him, but he's considered to be one of the smartest people in Washington. Yeah. And of course, he ran Biden's campaign, and they don't screw up much. They don't leak very much. And I think that's pretty significant because it's almost demeaning in a way, because what you want to hear from the vice president is, oh, I have lunch with the president once a week, yeah, on Tuesday afternoons our meeting, that's the thing you always hear from vice presidents. And I thought that was kind of interesting that A, that would be released, and B, it's probably a really smart thing for them to do, though I don't think it's that smart for them to have let it out that way.
Yeah, I think I can imagine some conservative listeners to this podcast saying, "Well, she is having lunch with the president, Ron Klain." Oh, I see. Yeah. But all I'd say is I'll just say a couple of random things about Kamala Harris. The first of which is just on that quote we just played, the border thing. I actually think that goes to what I was saying before about social media. That this is another example of not wanting to give in to the right, because they were harassing her about that really early on. It was really, really obvious that they were making a thing of it. And if you wanted to give in to it, the administration would have organised a meet for her to go to the border for a photo op about 3 months ago. It was just so obvious this was coming, and then they've just gone on with it, and now she's still not really bending because she doesn't want to give them anything. Yeah. And to be honest, that's probably a smart thing from her base's point of view, because her base don't want her to give them anything, because that's the way the rules are played now. But for the smart thing from a general electorate's point of view would have been ages ago to see this coming and to just give in, because there's no point. Why fight? Yeah. Why fight that? That's just a photo op. Just give him a photo op. So it's just. And so Clinton would have done it like on the day after he was appointed if he was in their position. He would have
driven people crazy. Right, exactly. Yeah. And then there's another tradition of the American vice presidency is that the VP is sort of the attack dog of the administration. And you kind of also wonder why she couldn't just say, look, we all know what the issue is. President Obama reduced immigration mightily. Donald Trump and all his racist counterparts, these are the people who fly Confederate flags. They hate brown people. They hate black people. We've seen that happen. They've demonized this. This is an economic issue. We want these countries to not have this thing. That's the solution. We're talking symptoms versus problems. We're working on the problems. We're not going to kowtow to these racist people anymore. I don't understand why the word race, she's not using the word racist every other word. That's another thing I don't understand, particularly when it comes to immigration, and just to kind of brush those people back a little bit.
To be fair to Kamala Harris, I understand. Well, I can't read her mind. I think I understand why she's not using the word racist a lot more. I think as a black person, you don't want to be throwing the word racist around much to a white electorate. Yeah. Like Barack Obama stayed so far away from that kind of stuff, and on the brief occasions that he got close, they never let him forget it. They still go on about that beer summit with the cop.
Oh yeah. No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and that was.
And he finally did that. He finally did a really great speech about it. It was like 6 years into his presidency or something like that. I forget when exactly it was. But still, then the Biden group should be having these surrogates to be brushing back on that issue and give her some cover. And I don't think they're very comfortable with it. And again, I don't understand why they're not damaging the Republican brand on that issue.
Yeah. Well, just to finish off, I was just going to say that I feel like she's on a real hard into nothing on this immigration job, not just because of the things you've already said, but on top of that, she's the one who's got to deliver the hard line, the do not come stuff. She's got a whole career of quotes behind her, of her saying the direct opposite.
Yeah.
And it makes her look like a hypocrite when she's delivering the message on behalf of the administration. Get someone else to do it.
Yeah.
It's not even her job.
But I'm glad you brought that up because this is another thing that vice presidents have to do. And it's kind of interesting whether she'll get a pass on it because she is a woman, because she is a person of color, but every vice president, George Bush Sr., they all have to completely eat their words and say, oh, I was wrong. The President Reagan was so right. President Clinton was so right. You know, they all have to eat their words later on, and that's a right of humiliation that every VP has to do.
And that's fine, and she has to as part of her job. But in this instance, they're creating this instance for her to do it. Well, they don't need to do it. Yeah. Get the Attorney General to do it. Get someone else to do it. Yeah. Anyway.
But by the way, did we talk about the Sister Soldier moment? Did we ever talk about that?
I have talked about it, but
I want some Sister Soldier moments. I really honestly do.
We should
I think that would be
explain to people what you're talking about.
100 years ago, Bill Clinton just reminded me. Bill Clinton was so good at this. There was some completely insignificant person. Her name was Sister Soldier, and she said some ridiculous thing that all activists of all stripes say, and this had something to do with not liking white people, or had a little bit of a firebrand kind of thing that you'd hear from black radical back. This is in the early 90s. And Bill Clinton just stood up and go, oh, I think this is terrible. She's racist and we don't believe in that kind of stuff. And just overnight made this woman a household name. Yes. And a Sister Soldier moment is when a politician goes after some incredibly easy target in their own camp to kind of show his independence from that. From any strictures of that camp. Yeah. And I would like to see the Democrats do more of that.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd say about Kamala Harris is you mentioned a couple of articles being written about her. I've noticed a couple of articles in CNN which involved leaks from the Biden administration. I've seen almost...
See, that's a really good point.
I've seen almost no articles leaking about Biden, but I've seen articles leaking about her from anonymous officials. And I wonder what's going on there. Because, they run a tight ship, like you said, about Biden. But all of a sudden, there was one article about how her aides were panicking when she was given the assignment on the border because they were afraid to be mischaracterized. It could be politically damaging. There was another article about how some administration officials are quietly perplexed about what they perceive as her bumpy answers to questions about whether she'll go to the US-Mexico border. Now, there's been none of that crap about Biden, ever. Yeah. But it's some of it is out about her, so I wonder what's going on internally.
And it could be because I didn't do the timeline and all those things, but it could be that the Time stories were a reaction to that because everyone was on the record. They were all being supported. There were all these people like Donna Brazile giving her side of it and saying that she wanted these hard assignments, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe those are the reactions. Okay. But also there is this bumpiness. We're still in the opening months of an administration that's dealing with extraordinary problems, and I don't think these are real big issues. But I've always been a little bit suspicious of her because I think not suspicious of her, but I don't think she ran a good campaign. No. And she didn't have a good staff. And so the other thing that I thought was really interesting in the Time stories is it really felt like, and again, this is a little bit condescending, but you got the sense that Biden was going to conscientiously, quote unquote, keep her under his wing and be, in theory, showing her how to govern correctly if indeed she's going to be the anointed successor.
I'm going to skip past Department of Justice issues for now. We might come back to that. But there's two things that you particularly want to talk about, so I want to make sure we cover them before we run out of time, because I don't want to have a 2.5-hour podcast today like I did last time, which is you want to talk a bit culture war. And
my God,
cancel
let's talk
culture.
about that.
So let's get into that, shall we?
Well, there's been some really great new entries in the cancel culture wars. I don't know if you know that woman who was in The Office, and her name is she's on
Ellie Kemper.
Yeah, she was on Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Yeah, and she has this bright smile, and she plays this really great character. Generally, this kind of slightly vacuous but well-meaning and happy and utterly optimistic person. So it turned out that when who knew she went to Princeton first of all, but she went to Princeton. Yeah. So life is really good if you're Ellie Kempner.
Yeah, and her family's very rich.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't even know that. Yeah. But it turns out that she had been some sort of a homecoming queen to some group that had some obvious ties to not the Old South, but some white, I don't know, how would you characterize it? Had some suspiciously racially white positive background.
I would characterize it this way. It took until 1979 until this group allowed blacks or Jews to join them.
Yeah,
that's how I'd characterize it.
So it's kind of like the Mormon Church, or the Australian Club. Did you see the news about that today? They voted they weren't going to allow women in. So, and to her credit, and she is a very smart person because she went to Princeton, she said, you know what? I did this. I was wrong. I was old enough to know better, she said. I thought it was a very, very good forthright response. But she's the latest so-called victim of the sort of cancel culture.
Well, to be fair, sorry, you keep on talking now, I'll jump in.
No, go ahead. I want to hear what
I was going to say that in the end, she really wasn't a victim at all because it didn't cost her anything because she came out with a very quick apology and it was accepted.
Well, let's see though. I mean, you just don't know. I mean, because a lot of all these street, you don't. But of course, these days it's so complicated because she could have been on the verge of a new Netflix deal and that got bounced, and maybe it's going to end up going to CBS All Access. So you don't kind of understand what exactly is happening behind the scenes.
What I'll say, first of all, I'll just add a little bit more context on the charge, and then I want to actually read bits of her apology because I found her apology quite interesting. So like you said, she went to this ball, I think they're called the Veiled Prophets or something like that, back when she was 999, and she was crowned beauty queen. They call it the Queen of Love and Beauty. Yep. Anyway, until 1979, there were no Jews or blacks. By 1999, they definitely were Jews and blacks. And on the night that she was there, the Temptations performed, Hootie and the Blowfish performed, and Dionne Warwick performed, all on the night. Okay, so that one night. So that definitely was an issue then. But anyway, on Twitter they started calling her a KKK princess and stuff, and there was a lot of pile on. And then she came up with this apology, which I'll read you now. This is most of it. It's not all of it, but it's most of it. When I was 19 years old, I decided to participate in a debutante ball in my hometown. The century-old organisation that hosted the debutante ball had an unquestionably racist, sexist and elitist past. I was not aware of the history at the time, but ignorance is no excuse, as you said, Bill. I was old enough to have educated myself before getting involved. I unequivocally deplore, denounce and reject white supremacy. At the same time, I acknowledge that because of my race and my privilege, I'm the beneficiary of a temptation when you become... I'm a beneficiary of a system that has dispensed unequal justice and unequal rewards. There is a very natural temptation when you become the subject of internet criticism to tell yourself that your detractors are getting it all wrong. But at some point last week, I realised that a lot of the forces behind the criticism are forces I've spent my life supporting and agreeing with. I believe strongly in the values of kindness, integrity and inclusiveness. I try to live my life in accordance with these values. If my experience is an indication that organisations and institutions with pasts that fall short of these beliefs should be held to account, then I have to see this experience in a positive light. So that's how she put it. Now my take on this is that I agree that she dealt with it as well as you possibly could. I disagree that someone who's 19 should be expected to research the background of every institution that they visit on the off chance that they happen to be racist 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. I reckon that if that's the case, people shouldn't be drinking Fanta because that's a Nazi drink, and and it's true, and people shouldn't play golf at any golf club whatsoever because all of them had some pretty nasty rules not too long ago, and that's adults, let alone 19-year-olds. I think those standards are ridiculous. I think you should be expected to not go for beauty queen at a racist pageant, but if the pageant was racist 20 years ago. And it hasn't been since, I don't think she should be held responsible for that. That's my and I reckon she learnt the wrong lesson. I think the lesson when she thought they were being unreasonable, and then she realised that she usually agreed with these people, so she thought, well, maybe I think the right lesson is maybe I have a new perspective on the way that these people conduct themselves, and I should be more tolerant in future to other people. But no, the lesson she learnt was no, they're right. I'm wrong to think they're unreasonable, and I think that's the wrong lesson myself.
Okay, I think that's I kind of see what you're saying, but you
I
have
think
to
she's
admit
smart.
it's very smart.
I think she's smart. I agree completely.
Okay, and then the other thing I think about all these is that that in economic terms, you have all these products that come out, right? And all these companies, there'll be 20 companies, and they all have this great product, and they're all doing whatever. They're all cutting people's hair in this one part of town, and you have this churn. Some are good, some are bad, some fail, some buy each other out, some fall by the way. They have a great product, but they don't keep their books well. I mean, there's this churn, okay? And that sometimes in all this cancel culture stuff, this is what I think about it generally, is that we're focusing on the churn, and we're not focusing on the bigger picture.
That's true.
Okay? And so one of the reasons I don't like talking about cancel culture is because I think it's a little decadent and jejune, if I can use that word, and that that the terrible things that happen to people all across, and let's just talk about America here, that, we go, oh, here's someone who went to Princeton and she's a movie star and this thing happened to her. Well, let me tell you what goes on in Mississippi every single day and in Tennessee, but even in upstate New York, and even sometimes in big cities, though they're a little bit better but you go outside of any relatively enlightened American city. I lived in Atlanta. You go 10 miles outside of Atlanta and you're in a very scary part of America, right? You go 10 miles outside of Phoenix, it's the exact same thing. You can go inside Phoenix and see some terrible things. And it's very antediluvian when you think about it, about the Australian club. I mean, how do you have this thing where you have all these big power shakers and they don't let women in? It just seems very, very, very wrong. And so I think that we should always remember that there's cities in America, there's small towns all throughout the South that get an extraordinary part of their budget just by pulling black motorists over the side of the road and fining them all the time, and they have this history of the stopping black Americans from gaining wealth and taking the wealth they do have. And of course we have this anniversary of the Tulsa riots, of course, which got a lot of attention because that's another significant thing. So sometimes I worry that even the amount of time that's spent talking about someone like her or the guy at The Bachelor or Kevin Hart, that wow, these forces that have created these big problems over the year that allow unarmed black people to be shot, and just the economic forces that keep them out of jobs and loans and all this other stuff should be focused on a little bit more. So I feel bad for some of the people who get caught up in this counterculture bullshit. And I speak that as a reporter, a white male reporter, and God knows I might say something, or I might have said something on Twitter over the years and I'm from Berkeley, so I'm very politically correct, right? So I'm very careful about that stuff. But, but for the grace of God go a lot of people in the public eye. So I do kind of think that even the people who do kind of get in fairly, she's a very successful person. She has a lot of money. She's been in 2 syndicated TV shows. And let me tell you, all you got to be is on one syndicated TV show and you're kind of set for life. Yeah. So she has a lot of very powerful friends, and I think she'll be okay. Oh yeah, I'm not crying for her. Yeah. And we should talk about the Bachelor guy because he's an interesting one because he's even better off than she is. I'll tell you why when we get to him. But I think you make an excellent point. I'm not worried about her at all, and I'm not worried. But there are people, and there's another one, a good example that we've talked about off air, where someone who's not at all fortunate gets screwed over. But I completely acknowledge that there are. Sorry, let me put this differently. I agree with your major point that you have just said, which is we tend to focus on what is happening right now to the people who are making a big noise and waving their hands, or who our attention is drawn to, and we don't focus on where we are at in a society in 30 years' time when this is all worked out, which is a much better place. And I'll give you a great example of that, I think, off the top of my head, which is that when the Me Too thing started, there were a number of examples, I thought, that I read about where I thought to myself, I'm not sure I do actually believe that person, that woman. I don't think I necessarily do believe her. But when we went through this period, where there was possibly some overcorrection, there was possibly some, as what you refer to as roughage, the churn, yeah. But I feel like at the end of that process, women are going to be treated much better as a result, and that is extremely important for society. Absolutely. Like I feel like that period is So the to and fro is going to result in some people being treated poorly, but millions, if not hundreds of millions, if not billions of people will be better off at the end of that process. So it's a process you need to go through. Yeah, exactly. And what I always say about the Me Too is that outside of every American city, and some in Australia too, you go a few miles out on the freeway and there's this big, huge intersection, and there's about 4 big shopping centers. There's a Home Depot, which is like a Bunnings except bigger, and a Lowe's, which is like a Bunnings and bigger, and Pier 1 Imports and Walmarts and grocery stores, and between 50 and 30 fast food operations and stuff like that. And I'll bet you that in a weekend, in just one of those, and again, there's multiple of them outside every American city of any size, more terrible stuff, like actual criminal stuff in terms of sexual assaults or extortions or discriminations on any number of levels happen than in all the kind of unfair cancel cultures or unjustly accused A2P. I mean, just in literally just one of those. I mean, there's so many opportunities for the victimization of course, single mothers and things like that, not to mention people of color, immigrants, people who don't speak English, people who might be scared, and also all the kind of more service industry things where you have a lot of immigrants who are being overpaid and working in bad conditions, or being exposed to chemicals and in nail salons and things like that. Particularly in states that, again, we live in big cities, and so there's a lot of regulation of those sorts of things. You get outside the big cities, and then there's no regulation at all.
Can we talk about the Bachelor guy quickly?
Yes.
Because I think that's a great example of one where I would. People would expect me, if they know me well, to expect me to always be against cancel culture all the time, because I'm Mr. Libertarian. So, of course, I don't like people being cancelled for speech. But this is one example where I'm a bit on the fence. So why don't we just talk about him?
Well, and this is the one where he voiced some. I thought it was kind of interesting because he was voicing support for someone he liked, right?
Yeah, Rachel Kirkconnell.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of because there's a whole other thing that happens that where there's someone you know or you like, and you sort of come to their defense, and then you get caught in the thresher as well.
We should just tell these people. We should tell these people what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So Chris Harrison's been host of The Bachelor since 2002.
Right.
All right.
The original host.
So forever. And there's in their latest series, it was Rachel and Matt. Matt was their first black bachelor, I believe, and Rachel was looking like she was going to be chosen by him, and then it came out that, not on the show, mind you, off the show, it came out that she attended an antebellum themed fraternity event in 2018 dressed as a Southern Belle. It's not like they had like slaves or something. They were just dressed in frilly dresses, right? But antebellum means before the Civil War, and people go, oh, slavery. And so then online, all of a sudden the online sleuths jumped on to try and find out all about her. And they said, oh, it turns out her parents are Trump voters. They couldn't find out who she votes for, but her parents are Trump voters. And they were looking around for stuff, and they found some example of her apparently in some video speaking rudely to a black person. They go, oh, she's racist. Anyway, and so it was a real witch hunt vibe to it at this point in time. So anyway, Chris Harrison was doing one of their extras, their Bachelor extras, where he was talking to a previous contestant, was it Rachel Lindsay? Oh, I don't remember her name. Who was black as well, and they were talking about this. And Chris Harrison, I've got the quote here. Well, not the quote, one of the quotes, because he went on about it for 20 minutes. He said, we all need to have a little grace, a little understanding, a little compassion, because I've seen some stuff online, this judge, jury, executioner thing, where people are just tearing this girl's life apart and diving into like her parents voting record. It's unbelievably alarming to watch this. I haven't heard Rachel speak on this yet. Until I actually hear this woman have a chance to speak, who am I to say any of this? I saw a picture of her at a sorority party 5 years ago, and that's it. And do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, exactly. So And again, because I basically agree with you too. Being a journalist, I support free speech and stuff like this. Nobody likes a gang. Nobody likes a mob. Nobody likes, and there's so many enclaves in America, right? And so
I should say he's no longer the Bachelor host after that.
Yeah, no, he lost his position, right? That there's so many enclaves, and so many of these people live in enclaves, right? And they see things that go on in other places, and they feel frustrated. It's just this collegiate thing. We all went to college. We know how you feel, like, oh my God, there's racial injustice. And so you go home and you yell at your dad about it, and your dad's going, what are you talking about? I've been like, my dad, I'm sure I said I would come home from college and be saying things, and he'd say, you know what? I was out fixing roofs and doing sewer fixing and laying floor stuff and building a fence for these people in the hot Arizona sun. But Bill, you keep telling me more about racism.
Yeah.
So they transfer that energy to Twitter, and of course, and what happens, of course, is you fire at the people who are closest to you, and this thinking that you're fighting this bigger battle. So that's another very jejune kind of thing that goes on, and it's really silly and sad, right? So I really agree with you that so much of it is silly. And how can you disagree with someone who's saying, I think we need a little bit of grace, when it comes to these things, right? So it is unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, that one actually, ironically, I'm less down on than the others, and I'll tell you why. The reason for that is because I just gave the key quote there, and I agree with you. Obviously, no one could I think no one reasonable could disagree with that viewpoint that he expressed there. But he went on about it for ages. Like I would love to play you a grab, but there's no point because it's about the total experience. You'd have to sit there and watch him for 15 minutes to see him repeat himself over and over again. And you got this very strong sense that he was choosing his words carefully, but he meant a lot more passionate than what he was saying. And I felt, and so I thought to myself, now The Bachelor is a show that's had race problems for a decade. There's been a constant issue of there's been too many white people for American TV at least. Yeah. And they tried to address it now in like its 20th year with this Matt guy. But the overwhelmingly white show. And they've had, racial problems. So they were already looking for an excuse, I'm sure, to have a black host. Yeah. Such an obvious thing to do. If you're in their position and you seem stale, you need a bit of a shake-up. And like I say, they would have already been thinking that. And then this guy comes along, and he's no special talent, Chris Harrison. Let me tell you, he's the standard host. Yeah. And he clearly has a bit of a bone to pick about this. Like he's trying to couch his words carefully, but you can read between the lines pretty clearly that this guy has very strong opinions about what he referred to as, quote, the woke police at one point in time. And so I can see why they would have said, you know what, this is a perfect opportunity to rebrand the show. And I don't think what was happening here was them giving in to cancel culture. I think what was going here was them exploiting cancel culture to rebrand the show in the way they wanted to rebrand it.
No, I mean it's incredibly possible that it happens, but again, the other thing in those shows they have long-term plans. I mean, you got unless the organization is in some sort of a tumult, you got to figure there's people saying, look, we know he's on his way out. We want to bring in someone new at some point.
Also, I think if you're on air, and I say this as someone who's on air, that you need to be nimble with this kind of stuff. When there is delicate, controversial issues, you need to be intelligent. And you need to step intelligently to make sure you don't step on any landmines.
Right, and
that's your job as a host. That's your job.
That's what exactly. I so agree with you. I was going to say he was not doing his job.
Yes, he wasn't. He wasn't doing
his job
poorly. He's supposed to look good and not cause a controversy. And he stuffed it up. Yeah. And he stuffed up because he wanted to stuff it up because he was passionate about this issue that he wanted to stuff up.
And I don't know The Bachelor very well.
And by the way, he got a payout of tens of millions of dollars. Yeah. So he'll be okay.
There was some good reporting that said his manager was doing some, I think in Deadline or something, they were saying which is good on this, that his manager had some angle with the network and was going for the maximum payoff. Yeah. And we have to remember though that reality TV, just any association with reality TV from the start, this was something I covered extensively when it first, when the first Survivor Big Brother happened around the year 2000, I guess. Yep. They damaged black figures just terribly, and it took them quite a few years to get to the point where you might have a black winner or a serious black contender, or a black contender who didn't turn out to be a buffoon or corrupt or a liar or a cheat. They were all getting bounced off, and it was really awful how reality TV treated black people for a long time. And considering how fake and how scripted so much of this allegedly unscripted material isn't, it was doubly reprehensible. So you could say that this is one of the things that drives the so-called woke warriors crazy, because let's talk about, here's this poor guy who's the victim of cancel culture. Let's talk about how reality TV has handled people of color over the past 20 years. Yeah. And as someone who covered it extensively from the beginning, I can tell you it was really, really unattractive.
That's a fair point. So, and I also feel as well there's a big difference between him and the Ellie Kemper situation as well. As the Ellie Kemper thing was 20 years ago. Him was right now in the middle of this.
Yeah.
Like, he should have known better. And, and so I think that's a complete, to me, I have much less sympathy towards him than I did with Ellie Kemper. Can we mention the Barry Weiss thing quickly?
No, that's exactly what I wanted to do.
Because that's a classic example of someone who it's just...
Wait, and are you talking about the Pakistani family?
Yeah, the Pakistani family. Where you go, because they always say it's consequence culture. It's not cancel culture, it's consequence culture. Well, let's hear about that.
So let me find the thing about it. Sorry, I lost it here. So Barry Weiss is really interesting because she's a longtime opinion editor at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
Okay, and then she ended up at the New York Times.
Yeah.
And then she became a real firebrand on the subject of political correctness and stuff like this. Yeah. And her notoriety grew and grew, and she finally quit the Times in a big blaze of glory and denouncing and saying it was too politically correct and that she'd been drummed out of it. I kind of know her and I like her. She's always been really great to me, and I think she's really smart. But now she's Barry White Unbound.
Yeah.
And she's been writing all this crazy stuff, mostly on Substack. So this, and give me just 1 second here. Let me find this thing about this family. And they were in Minneapolis, and this young woman had done some explicitly racist tweets.
Yeah, let me just say that they ran a hummus company. They were selling hummus.
The Good Life.
It's called the Holy Land.
Holy Land.
Yeah,
right.
Holy Land. Yeah. Hummus company. And they're Pakistani immigrants. They built it up from zero. They had like 200 employees. It was a big business based in Minnesota. And then when the George Floyd thing happened, people noticed these tweets from his daughter from 2012. So from 8 years earlier, when his daughter was 16. Go for it.
And she had authentically changed over the years. She had done all these terrible things. And these aren't things where they're just sort of a little bit politically incorrect. There have been a couple of instances where people are just kind of, and sometimes kids, you're in that kind of world where you say things that are seemingly anti-gay, but really it's just the way kids talk, that they feel they're very enlightened, but you can hear people use certain words that you wouldn't ordinarily.
Top 3 races you wish to eliminate. Ready? Go. Jews, blacks, and the fats. So that's not a great tweet. It's not a great tweet, has to be said.
Not at all.
But she's 16.
Right.
Yeah.
And so since then, her social media had been a lot more enlightened. That's the other ironic thing, that she was
less about eliminating Jews, blacks, and fats.
No, but apparently she had supported things for Black Lives Matter and stuff like this because you.
She marched. She marched with BLM. Yeah.
So the funny thing is her dad fires her.
Yes, when that tweet came out, there was pressure on her dad to fire her, and he did. He fired her.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Eleanor.
And she put
we have
out
to part ways.
She put out. She did the tour of shame. She put out apologies in the news and all that kind of stuff. Yep.
And that still didn't stop people from targeting her family's business. Yeah.
Yeah, and they got their lease torn up. A lot of the people they were selling to didn't want to have anything to do with them anymore. Costco just dumped them. And their home address was spread online. They had to move out. This is after the apologies.
This seems like another example of where this sort of mob-like behavior is collecting a victim.
Yeah, and then 69 people were sacked from the business. Yeah. 69 people that were facing the consequences of this consequence culture who had nothing to do with it. I mean, her dad had nothing to do with it. No one had anything to do with it except for her, and she was fired. Yeah. So, but everyone else paid the penalty.
And it really is unfortunate because the energy of the people, the energy of the people online is actually fairly little, right? It doesn't take that long to just throw a few tweets out there and stuff. It was really unfortunate because you want to say, why couldn't they focus that energy to a more productive end, right? And there seems to me it is possible that we're going to get a few of these and people are going to get to the day, okay, wait, this is one of these that isn't really fair. I think, people do learn. Right? I mean, society does learn, and it could be we're going to look back on this. Like, I'm sure that it happened in the 60s, too, during the Civil Rights era. There was a little, quote-unquote, overkill, though obviously there wasn't enough. Let's remember that even after the Civil Rights marches and all the protests and all the terrible things that happened in the 60s in America, a lot of it was never even and the other side always fights back, right, with lies and disingenuous. And this comes in America, right, the South. Churches, schools, elected officials, large businesses, they were on the side of the racists and they were against the protests and also their own constituents, right? So again, I think that this is a little bit of churn, but it definitely is unfortunate, and you really hope that these online mobsters would take it down a couple notches.
Actually, I think there's something which people don't realize about this, which is I understand the instincts. People feel like they want to help. They want to help. They want to make a difference. So when they see an injustice, what they see as an injustice, they want to do whatever they can to correct it. And, it's so easy, as you say, just to send out a tweet. That's what you can do. Yeah. And everything helps. It all helps make a difference. I can see what they're thinking. In the case of some kind of big figure, like a politician or a megastar, then yes, you need thousands of people to take them on if you're going to take them on. That's true. So everyone does make a difference in that case. In the case of some schlep who's just on social media for whatever reason, you can't make a difference. And I'll tell you why. Because actually that's not true. You can make a bad difference. You can't make a good difference. And I'll tell you why. Because the difference has already been made. By the fact that you know about it, it means it's already got out there. Yeah. And they are already sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah.
The fact that the moment you found out about it, they were already sorry. They'd already learnt their lesson. And anything you do is either bullying them or making someone else pay for it. That's all you can do. They're your only options. Yeah. So you can just see it and then go, well, justice has been done. They found out about it. I found out about it, so therefore it got out, so therefore they're sorry. Just leave it at that. Just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Never join an online pile-on, please, for an anonymous person. Oh, yeah, for a nobody. Yeah. I don't mind pile-ons for big figures. I mean, real big stars, but for nobodies, just never do it.
That's such an interesting point. And sometimes it does feel like bullying online, but it really isn't bullying because it is that kind of innocuous little minuscule little effort, like, oh, this is bad, yeah, click, retweet, and stuff like that. And you're really not bullying, but you become part of a bullying mob.
Oh yeah, you are. Take it from me, I've never been subjected to the mob treatment, the full-on mob treatment, but I've been subjected to enough outrages in my career to tell you that 10 tweets feels like 1,000. It really does. And 10 negative tweets feels like 1,000, and 100 negative tweets feels like everyone on earth. And if you were subject of 10,000 negative tweets, you'd want to kill yourself. Yeah. You absolutely would.
That's so funny because you're a provocateur too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So I was a columnist for a long time, and originally before the internet, and the letters page would just be full of denunciations of me, and the places where I worked, they printed every letter. So even the ones threatening violence, describing dismembering me and things like that, they just blandly printed everything, right? And so I love that interaction because I think writers, particularly back then, if you worked at a newspaper, you had all this power. And so it's like, we get to have our say, and then everyone else gets to say, and you don't get to mouth back. You should just let that come. So I love that, and I think that's part of the great American ideal of that free exchange, and you shouldn't let people have the last say. So I kind of like it in a way. But again, when we're talking about these indefensible people, it does seem very out of balance.
I'll tell you the difference between letters to the editor and tweets, because I've had both. I've had letters to the ABC and I've had tweets. The difference is letters to the ABC, when it's a letter to the editor, you're seeing it on your terms. You go, okay, now it's time to see the letters to the editor. What have we got here? Oh, look at that one. Look at that one. You're seeing, having a good laugh. That's fantastic. It's exactly what we're like with complaints to the ABC. But tweets, they keep on coming. They come all day and all night, and every time you open your phone, they're there. Every single time. And it really builds up. It builds up over. Trust me, when you're in the middle of a pile-on, it builds up. Yeah. And you open up your phone for the 15th time. You go, fuck, another one. Fucking hell! It really does.
Does it bother you?
It does. And let me tell you, I am Buddha compared to most of the people in the entertainment industry. I'm a real water off a duck's back kind of a guy, but it really gets you down. And it's I can only imagine how much it must hurt people who haven't been trained to deal with it. Because that's the other thing. These people have not had the training. They have not had the experience. It just came out of nowhere.
Yeah, the world comes down on them.
Most people who are columnists or who are media people don't just debut on Complaint Street. They debut in some shitty area where they get maybe one complaint. And then they build up to 2 or 3, and they build up to 10, and so on. That was my experience with TV. I started small and I built up. These people who debut on social media outrage, they start with 10,000.
Yeah.
And I just
see, and I always put it in the context of I don't complain when 1,000 people say I did a great article. Yeah. So, occasionally, like I was in the Thresher a few years ago because I wrote a big story on Michael Jackson, and boom, I still get little things like that because the Michael Jackson people are really out of their minds. And believe it or not, Pink Floyd people. They're another difficult one. Yeah. So another aspect of this is that when we're talking about the famous people, and one person I was thinking of was Kevin Hart, because Kevin Hart did some interviews this week where he started retracting his retractions a little bit. And if you remember, he was going to be the Oscar host, and then the stuff came out about his having done some impolitic tweets about gays, and then so he kind of fought it for a while, but then I guess he actually apologized before the Oscars. He did. But he had to apologize again.
He apologized originally back in 2011.
Before then.
Yeah.
And then he kind of felt like, well, I'm not going to apologize again. And then after he didn't get it, he sort of did. And then he did this, what I thought was the worst thing of all, which he did this interview at one point. He says, well, yeah, but but at a certain point, Ellen DeGeneres and someone else, came and talked to me. And then I really started seeing it from their perspective. And it's just like, really? It took Ellen DeGeneres to tell you. That's how, when you had your, that you couldn't have, it's going to be a Marjorie Taylor Greene thing we'll talk about later. It's the same phenomenon.
We're not going too much longer, so you might want to bring it
up. But let's remember that these guys live extraordinary lives. Kevin Hart, he's made a lot of money. Yeah. He flies first class. He eats everywhere, the best thing. He has a reservation anywhere he wants. He sees any show he wants. Anything happens, he hangs out with the coolest people in the world. I don't know what his personal life is like, but if he's single, he has a lot of sex, okay? And this thing where this one bad thing happens, and then all of a sudden you've been crucified and you're the big victim and stuff like that. That's another thing we have to remember, is that even being a dumb columnist or whatever, life is pretty good. You get in free to rock and roll shows, you get in free to movies, you get all this cool stuff, and the fact that every once in a while some people yell at you on Twitter, I personally welcome. I mean, I'm totally happy to take that. And I wish that in the coverage of the famous people, they kind of explain that a little bit. But of course, no, they want, obviously they want the clicks too. Like, oh, Kevin Hart, he's complaining again about how he was cancel cultured at the Oscars.
By the way, on that note, with the famous people, one thing that irritates me about this is when people complain about cancel culture is the inverted commas cancelers have no power of their own. You give them the power. There are 2 levels of power that can be given to them. One is from you cancelling yourself, which is often what happens. Like people stepping down from things and going off to be further educated and so on. Yeah. And the second is if they work on your sponsors, you'll work on your bosses, and then they cancel. But once again, it's your bosses and your sponsors that give them the power. They have no power of their own. And so, personally, speaking for myself, and this is, as you say, I am at times a provocateur, and so this is something that I've thought about. Yeah, I may have to face at one point in time. Yeah, especially given I have a tendency to say what I think. If it happens to me, and
mm-hmm. I'm going to back you up, Chaz.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Well, wait till you see what I said first. Yeah. If it happens to me, and okay, and I think that what I said was fine, and I think that, or what I did or fine, or that they're going back 10 years to a tweet or whatever, something which I would not criticize someone else for, I'm not going to apologize. When I say I'm not going to apologize, I'm not going to be an asshole about it. If I may express regret for pissing people off, because that would certainly be the case. That is my view. My view is, as an entertainer, if you piss people off, you failed. You've got to be, like I just said before, you've got to be nimble. You've got to be delicate. You've got to be sensible and clever about it. And I might apologize for that, but I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to go and re-educate myself kind of tweet like Ellie Kemper did. And this was all a positive for me because I've learnt the error of my ways. I'm not going to be doing that. Yeah. And because I feel like, and celebrities, Kevin Hart did that shit. I don't think that, I don't think you should lie. I don't think you should lie. I think you should be honest. And you should, and when I say honest, I don't mean honest in a Carl Sanderlands way where you're being obnoxious. I mean honest and caring and open-hearted.
Yeah.
But not bullshit people. And I feel like that if everyone just did that, then the issue would be over tomorrow.
Yeah, and I really agree with that too, and with two caveats. One is that I like apologizing, and I like acknowledging I got something wrong.
If you did get something wrong.
Because
Absolutely.
It gives me power.
Yeah.
It reinforces my integrity.
I apologize heaps. I screw up all the time, and I'm always apologizing.
All the time.
I'm saying when you feel like you haven't done something wrong.
Right.
Like, if I think I've done something wrong, if I think I fucked up, I am going to apologize. Absolutely. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that if I think that I am the subject of a beat up, which is just incorrect, I'm not going to pretend that it was correct. I'm just going to say it's hard for me to speculate because I don't know what we're talking about here. But I just think I hate the fact that celebrities who whinge about cancel culture feed the fire by giving into it and giving it more power.
But Kevin Hart was wrong though. I mean, that again, I always come back to gay issues because just growing up, I grew up in a really huge anti-gay world. And I was in my high school drama, and so basically all the other guys in the drama club grew up to be gay. Yeah. And this is in Phoenix, Arizona. A lot of them had really awful lives. Okay. So sometimes I think back on that and I think, I personally know like 6 guys who had their lives kind of seriously constrained and in one case fatally by the anti-gay culture that we grew up in. Okay? Like right then, that's a huge, enormous tragedy, right? That's in one little high school drama club, right? And so the reason I admire the Ellie Kemper thing is that she actually did, she was saying, look, I was just a dumb girl. I was just in this homecoming queen, Jesus. And then she's going, yeah, but like what went on in my town the 20 years before that happened, and where am I in that? And I kind of admired her saying, you know what, there are some bigger things and I am just one little dumb person. And when I say the word girl, I'm using that, in the way that she would kind of use it, that I do like that kind of open-hearted perspective, so I don't hold her. Sure. But I do agree with you that it does seem like at times people should stand by their friends and speak out for things.
And stand by themselves. By the way, I'm speaking from experience because I actually have been in a similar situation before, which you won't know about because you probably weren't in Australia at the time. But we did a sketch on one of our shows back 12 years ago, right at the beginning of this. And it was front page news, blew up big time, right? And the thing was, I actually thought when it blew up, I thought that our writing wasn't as good as it should have been, and so I actually was sorry. I actually thought, I think we could have done that better. I thought the sketch was fine. I thought it was definitely a beat up, but I thought we kind of fell into a little bit by not writing the sketch as well as we should have.
Yeah.
And we delivered an apology. I didn't say anything. The other guys said it. But in my view, at the time and since, I thought it was too groveling. And it wasn't nearly as groveling as the apologies now. But I've always regretted that.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I'm not going to let that happen again. And for those who are curious, try and find it.
Okay, I'll look into it. Can I mention one last thing? Just the other thing, just coming from America and having the First Amendment stuff like this. One thing I'm very conscious of is I'm incredibly arrogant. Okay, I'm an American journalist, and you just have that kind of arrogance of like you just get to say what you want and you don't have to apologize. And I've always had the luxury of working, any place I've worked basically. 100% I would feel that if I really screwed up, right, they would say, whatever. But I always would have felt that my places had my back 100%. Okay, so there is also that in my psyche that I try to really be aware that of the privilege that I've had in my life, and that I try to be humble about that stuff because I try to take that serious and not fall into that trap, which so many people do, frankly, particularly white guys, of acting and swaggering and that sort of. So that's why I like to say I'm wrong in a way, because I've lived my whole life among these swaggering newsroom type people. But I've had enormous privilege in that world of being able to say what I think. And not only that, but just knowing I can sleep well at night because nothing I could ever do would ever really get me in trouble. So it is kind of interesting to be a little worried these days about it.
That's fair enough. And while we're making concessions, I'm going to build up on the concession we made before, that these are dealing with real issues. Like some of these are really trivial and some of these are really stupid, these cancel culture examples. They're often about tweets and things that don't matter at all. But racism still exists. It really does. And people sometimes think that is just lefties going on being lefties. Let me give you an example that I think everyone can agree is indisputably a problem, whether you're Republican or Democrat or whatever. And this is happening right now. This is a news story which I cannot believe hasn't gotten more coverage from a week ago. Okay? It's about the NFL. Back in 2014, there was a settlement between the NFL and 4,500 ex-players. It's about $1 billion, the settlement. It was to compensate them for the effects of continuous concussions during their career, right?
Right.
We've had similar kind of situations in Australian sports as well. We haven't had the same kind of settlements, but we've had the same kind of concerns about repeated concussions. They give you literal brain damage, okay? Right? And so it's like literally these ex-players are brain damaged. Some of them die young because of it. Some of them end up with Alzheimer's because of it. Some of them are just like boxers post-career, just completely screwed up, right? Question is, how do you split up that $1 billion payout between the 4,500 ex-players? Right? Now, they decide to give the people with most severe brain damage the most money. That seems reasonable. How do you measure how much brain damage people have received? Because different people start at different positions, presumably, right? Enter the use of what they call race norming. This is what race norming is. It assumes that people of certain races begin with certain levels of cognitive functioning. In particular, it assumes that black players started out with lower levels of cognitive functioning. This is not from 1928. This is from now. From a settlement in 2014 until 2021. So these black players actually got lower payouts than a white or Hispanic person would get with the same brain injury because they were assumed to have started off a little bit stupider. That is now. Now, the NFL insists that this was not a mandatory decision-making tool. It was left to the discretion of doctors taking part in the settlement program to decide. And they said when we did race norming, when the doctors, they're distancing themselves, when the doctors came up with race norming, it was actually meant to help minorities, not meant to hurt them. And this has been unintentionally dispensed in the wrong way, right? That's what they're saying. It doesn't matter. The fact is, what I just described is what happened from 2014 until June 2021, this month. Wow. This is the month after the NFL said about George Floyd, the work for equitable justice must continue, and the NFL and its clubs are proud to work alongside NFL players to build a more just society. Anyway, America still has race problems.
Yeah. I really, really agree. And are we super out of time?
No, you can sneak in something else.
To go back to Barry Weiss, her latest campaign is there's a famous school in New York called the Beardsley School. Yeah. And so another one of her campaigns is she posted this letter from someone who went to one of these who is withdrawing his kid from this big school, right? Which is a big deal when you're that rich because you need your kid in the school too. Yeah. So just give me a second. Let me find it here.
Bring it up.
Okay. So So she prints the whole letter. And so, for example, and again, you have to understand this is a very, very wealthy guy who's in a state of high dudgeon, right? And he's like, I've had it with the school. I'm taking my kid, just thinking that he's really, because these are people, with all the ire of a Karen, going into a Trader Joe's and being upset about the asparagus or something.
Sure.
Right? Okay. So he writes this very long, multisyllabic, tedious, thing where he tries to genuflect and say all his liberal bona fides, stuff like this. But then he says, I object to the charge of systemic racism in this country and at our school. Systemic racism, properly understood, is segregated schools and separate lunch counters. It is the interning of Japanese and the exterminating of Jews. Systemic racism is unequivocally not a small number of isolated incidents over a period of decades. Now, this is really interesting because, again, Bari Weiss is a really smart person. Yeah. Okay, she was an opinionator at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. So, believe me, those people are a lot smarter than I am. Yeah. So, and here's this guy who obviously has a lot of money. Okay, but this is every single sentence of that is wrong. Yeah. Okay, because he doesn't understand what systemic racism. I mean, he's probably right about the school, right? It's it's on the Upper West Side of New York or wherever it is, and I'm sure that the actual racism that they're talking about the school, and I'm sure that some of these places, excuse my French, have chased themselves up their own asses, searching for these things to virtue signal and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist, right? But it's a small thing, okay? Like the aesthetic and intellectual outrages that would drive me crazy too. I'm sure if I was in his thing, I would say, why are we having these discussions in this place? But for him to say that, to understand what systemic racism is it comes down to all the blacks who couldn't get into these schools for so many years, all the people who've been excluded, and on so many other really super complicated issues like the development of private schools in America, right, which disproportionately affect people of color and immigrants and stuff like this, which of course are a big scam to take federal student aid money to get that money into the schools on the backs of these unfortunate kids, and then not really worried about educating them, and sometimes going out of business and leaving them with all the bills and stuff like that. Those, like the ways in which just the collapse of some private schools in America affects tens of thousands of lives. Yeah. And these are parents who are trying to raise their kids and educate themselves, and having all that money go down, and then have to go through the rest of their lives with these federal aid student loans on their backs, okay? Which, because of all these mechanisms, make it really hard to get outside of. That just that alone, like the decadence of focusing on this poor guy, this guy's little. This is probably the worst thing that's happened to him in his life, right? And here's these intelligent people writing all this stuff, and then people talking about it when all this other stuff hardly gets attention.
I honestly, I've talked about this with Dr. Dave before, but it just gets me down how little Americans, and particularly conservative Americans, seem to understand the concept of systemic racism. Because, as someone I'm a libertarian, okay, I'm really sensitive to these kinds of debates, these kinds of race debates, right? I'm really sensitive, but just there is no doubt there is massive systemic racism in America. I'll give you an easy, once again, an undeniable example of how this works. Systemic racism does not mean everyone's racist and the whole country's racist, which is how people interpret it. What it means is the way society is set up, you end up with racially discriminatory outcomes. And I'll give you an example. In America, funding for public schools comes from local taxes, right? So if you are in a poor area, your school has less money than if you are in a rich area. So guess what? If you're in a predominantly black, poor neighborhood, your school is shit. And then those kids are not going to go on to move into the rich area because they had a terrible education. And they end up poor, and then they move into another poor area where their kids are then going to go to a shit school. That's the way the system works against black people pulling themselves out of poverty, right? That's not anyone's fault. That's not one particular person. That's not some bad man's going around going, I'm being Mr. Racist. That's the way society is set up. And so you need to try and work against that in some capacity. There's just a fact that the median wealth of a black person in America is 10% of a white person's wealth, a median person's wealth, then you cannot tell me that that's because white people are 10 times more industrious and 10 times more hardworking and 10 times more. That's just obviously not true. There's obviously something going on there, right? So that's what systemic racism refers to. It's not an insult. It's not something that people should get all worked up about. It's just reflecting reality, and then you try and deal with it.
Yeah.
But anyway, another day.
Okay.
I've talked about that so often.
Yeah.
And,
we covered a lot.
We have. There's always stuff left over. You know what it's like. Thank you so much. I'm going to split this one up into two. I discovered that when we have 2-hour, 20-minute podcasts, that they fail when I try to export them all at once.
Oh,
so
no.
it's all right. I'm going to put in the two, and I'll put them back to back out straight away. So I won't spend all weekend trying to put them out. Thank you very much, Bill Wyman, special guest podcast. As always, tell people where they can find you.
Oh, well, they can find me on Twitter at Hitsville if you want
indeed.
to. Okay, and then and occasionally I write in the Sydney Morning Herald.
Excellent. And I will see you guys. I don't know when it's going to be. It's not going to be Friday, I don't think. It might be Monday. Hopefully be Monday. See you guys soon for the next one.
Thank you very much.